The forest had always been a place of stories, of whispered legends exchanged around campfires and hushed warnings shared by locals. But tonight, the woods seemed different, alive with an unspoken tension that sent shivers crawling up the spine of anyone daring to wander too deep. It was in the hushed stillness of Ohio's Full Trail that the legend lingered most strongly. A creature of impossible size, seen only in fleeting glimpses, but heard in low, guttural sounds that echoed through the trees. To many, it was just a story, a myth created to explain the unexplainable. But to others, it was a truth too terrifying to face. The sun hung low in the sky, spilling golden light through the thick canopy. It was the kind of evening where shadows stretched long and the world seemed to hold its breath. On the edge of the forest, in a small, creaky diner where the smell of coffee mingled with fried eggs, the locals exchanged their usual tales. The legend was a staple, something they'd all heard, but few would openly admit believing. "You know, they found more tracks last week," muttered Harold, a wiry man with calloused hands leaning over his steaming mug. His voice carried just enough weight to make even the most skeptical listener pause. "Out near the ridge, same as before. Big ones, bigger than any bear around these parts." "Again?" scoffed Lila, the young waitress who'd grown up rolling her eyes at such tales. "Harold, you've been seeing Bigfoot since 1975. Still no proof, huh?" But there was a shift in the air, a subtle change that silenced the chuckles and casual dismissals. Across the diner, a man unfolded a newspaper, its headlines stark against the faded ink. "Unexplained disappearances, Plague A. Full Trail. Is the legend real?" The diner fell quiet. For a moment, all anyone could hear was the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the distant chirp of crickets. Miles away, deep within the forest, the silence was different. It was thick, oppressive, as though the woods themselves were holding secrets too dark to share. The only sounds were the occasional crack of a branch and the distant rustle of leaves, stirred by a wind that felt colder than it should have. A young couple, Emily and Nate, had set out on an early evening hike, their boots crunching over the dirt trail. They'd heard the stories, laughed them off even, but now, with the shadows growing longer and the golden light fading to a dusky gray, there was a weight in the air they couldn't quite explain. "Nate," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. "Do you hear that?" He stopped, tilting his head. For a moment, there was nothing but the rustle of leaves. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound. A deep, low growl that vibrated through the ground and straight into their chests. "That's probably just a bear," Nate said, though his voice lacked conviction. He scanned the woods, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The forest around them seemed to close in, the trees suddenly taller, darker, as if they were being watched. Emily reached for his hand. "Let's turn back." They hadn't made it far when they found the footprints, massive impressions in the soft dirt, each one larger than any shoe they'd ever seen. The prints stretched deeper into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. "What made these?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Nate crouched down, tracing the edge of one with his finger. "Not a bear," he murmured. Above them, the forest seemed to exhale, and the sound came again, louder this time, closer. They rose slowly, their gazes locked on the darkness ahead. Whatever it wasn't alone. The growl echoed through the trees, sending a shudder through Emily as she clutched Nate's arm tighter. The weight of the sound wasn't just its volume, it carried something primal, a resonance that seemed to awaken a deep-seated instinct to flee. But they didn't move, rooted to the spot as the forest came alive with a symphony of whispers, the rustle of unseen movement, the snap of distant branches, and the faint but steady crunch of something enormous moving closer. Nate's eyes darted around, searching for an explanation, but his voice betrayed him when he finally spoke. "Stay calm. We're probably just spooking some wildlife." Emily wasn't convinced. Her breaths came quick and shallow as she pulled Nate back toward the trail. "Wildlife doesn't sound like that," she hissed. As if in answer, another noise joined the growing cacophony. A deep, rhythmic thud, like the sound of something heavy striking the ground in deliberate steps. Whatever it was moving closer, and the pattern didn't match the gait of any creature Emily could name. The sound seemed to come from all around them, as though the forest itself were closing ranks. "Okay," Nate muttered, more to himself than to Emily. "We should head back now." Emily didn't need convincing. They turned as one, quickening their pace down the path they'd taken earlier, but the sense of direction that had guided them before now felt off. The trail seemed narrower, the trees closer, as if the woods had shifted in their absence. The sun, once a golden beacon in the sky, had fully dipped below the horizon, and the light that remained was cold and silver, filtered through a rising mist. Did we take a wrong turn? Emily's voice cracked as she looked behind them. Her steps faltered. Nate, the footprints, they're gone. Nate stopped and turned, his heart pounding in his chest. She was right. The tracks they'd seen, the impossibly large impressions that had led them to this point, were no longer visible on the trail. The dirt was smooth, undisturbed, as though the forest had erased any sign of their discovery. That doesn't make sense, Nate whispered, crouching again to inspect the ground. His fingers brushed over the soil, but it was firm and unmarked. They were here. I know they were here. A sudden, sharp crack exploded through the air, the sound so loud it made Emily scream. Nate jumped to his feet, instinctively pulling her behind him as he scanned the shadows. A tree branch, thick and jagged, fell from above, landing with a deafening crash just feet from where they stood. It wasn't the wind. The branch had been torn free. Emily's grip on Nate's arm tightened, her nails digging into his skin. Something's out there, she choked, her voice rising in panic. Something's watching us. Nate swallowed hard, his own fear threatening to overwhelm him, but he forced himself to sound calm. Let's keep moving. We're not staying here. They broke into a hurried stride, each step feeling heavier than the last, as the oppressive air seemed to weigh them down. The sounds in the forest grew fainter behind them, but the silence that replaced them was worse. It was the kind of silence that felt intentional, deliberate, a warning. The mist thickened as they pressed on, and soon the trail ahead disappeared into a wall of white. Nate paused, holding up a hand to stop Emily. "Wait," he whispered. "Do you see that?" Through the haze, a shape began to emerge. It was tall, far taller than any man, and motionless, its silhouette stark against the misty backdrop. For a moment, it seemed like a trick of the light, but then it shifted, its massive form turning ever so slightly in their direction. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she clung to Nate. "That's not a person," she whispered. The figure remained still, but the weight of its presence pressed down on them like a physical force. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one arm, pointing into the fog. "Run," Nate whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of Emily's ragged breathing. This time, they didn't hesitate. They ran, their footsteps pounding against the ground as the forest came alive once more behind them. The rhythmic thudding returned, faster now, keeping pace with their frantic escape. Whatever had been watching wasn't content to let them go without a chase. The forest erupted around them as they sprinted through the dense mist. Every snap of a twig or crunch of leaves beneath their feet amplified into something monstrous in their minds. Emily's lungs burned, her breaths sharp and shallow, but she didn't dare slow down. Behind them, the thudding steps grew louder, relentless, each one accompanied by the faint tremor of the ground beneath their boots. "Keep going," Nate shouted, his voice hoarse, glancing back over his shoulder. The figure was no longer a shadow in the mist. It was moving now, its massive frame weaving through the trees with an unnerving ease that belied its size. Emily didn't look back. She couldn't. The primal fear coursing through her veins told her that if she so much as hesitated, whatever was chasing them would close the distance. The trail beneath her feet seemed to twist and shift, the familiar markers they'd passed earlier now absent or unrecognizable. It was as though the forest itself conspired against them, refusing to guide them out. Nate grabbed her arm, pulling her to the left as they veered off the main path. "This way," he panted. His grip was firm, but his hand trembled. He was just as scared as she was. The underbrush scratched at their legs, branches clawing at their faces as they pushed deeper into the unknown. The trees grew thicker here, their trunks wide and gnarled, their roots snaking across the uneven ground like traps waiting to ensnare them. The sound of pursuit never waned, and the creature's guttural growl reverberated through the air, closer now, like a warning they dared not ignore. Suddenly, Emily stumbled, her foot catching on an exposed root. She fell hard, the impact jarring her hands and knees as she hit the ground. Pain flared, but she barely registered it over the pounding of her heart and the deafening rush of blood in her ears. "Emily!" Nate skidded to a stop, doubling back to help her. His hands were under her arms in an instant, pulling her to her feet. "You okay?" I'm fine, she gasped, though her voice shook. Her palms were scraped raw, streaked with dirt and blood, but there was no time to check the damage. The thudding steps were closer than ever now, the heavy crunch of leaves and snapping branches just beyond the trees. Nate didn't let go of her as they started running again, his pace slower to match hers. "We can't stop," he urged, his tone tight with panic. "It's right behind us." Ahead, the forest seemed to open slightly, the mist thinning to reveal the faint outline of something man-made. Emily squinted through her fear and exhaustion, her heart leaping at the sight. "Nate, look!" she cried. "A cabin!" It was old, its roof sagging and its windows dark, but it was shelter, a possible barrier between them and the nightmare in pursuit. They stumbled toward it, their hope renewed by the sight of walls, however fragile they might be. As they reached the cabin, Nate threw himself against the door, his shoulder slamming into the wood. It groaned, but didn't budge. "Help me!" he barked, and Emily joined him, both of them shoving against the door until it finally gave way, swinging inward with a loud creak. They tumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind them. Nate fumbled for the lock, finding a rusted bolt that he slid into place with trembling hands. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by their ragged breathing. Emily pressed her back against the door, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. "Do you think it'll?" A deep, resonant thud against the door cut her off, shaking the entire cabin. Whatever was outside had followed them and wasn't about to let a flimsy door stand in its way. Nate grabbed a nearby chair, wedging it under the handle. "This isn't going to hold," he said, his voice low but steady. He scanned the room quickly, looking for anything they could use to fortify their position or defend themselves. Emily's gaze darted to the windows, their glass clouded with grime. Beyond them, the mist swirled, concealing the forest in an eerie, shifting veil. She took a step back, her hands trembling as she whispered, "It's out there, watching." And then came the sound that froze them both. Not a growl, not footsteps, but a low, rumbling chuckle, as though the creature knew exactly how trapped they were. The laughter, or whatever it was, felt wrong, deep, and guttural, reverberating through the air like it didn't belong to any living thing. It wasn't human, yet it carried a mocking cadence, as if the creature knew their fear, savoring it. Emily pressed herself tighter against the door, her body trembling. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her voice caught in her throat. Nate grabbed a rusted poker leaning against the stone fireplace, gripping it tightly as though it could offer some semblance of protection. His knuckles were white, his breathing uneven. "It's testing us," he muttered under his breath, his eyes darting to the windows and back to the door. "It knows we're trapped." Outside, the forest seemed alive with sounds, the crunch of heavy footfalls circling the cabin, the creak of bending wood, and the occasional, deliberate scrape against the walls. Emily's gaze locked on a window to her left. The glass was so dirty she could only make out vague shapes, but a flicker of movement caught her attention. Something large shifted outside, casting a shadow across the dim room. "We can't just sit here," Emily finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's only a matter of time before it." Another thud rattled the door, harder this time, causing her to jump. The chair wedged beneath the handle groaned under the force but held, though the sound of splintering wood sent a chill through both of them. Nate moved toward the window across from her, keeping low. He brushed away some of the grime with his sleeve, squinting through the streaked glass. For a moment he froze, his body stiffening. "I see it," he breathed, barely audible. Emily crept closer, her heart pounding. "What does it look like?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "It's massive," Nate said, his voice trembling. "It's just standing there, staring at the cabin. It's got these eyes, they're glowing like amber, and its face." He stopped, swallowing hard. "It's not just an animal, it's something else." Emily shivered, her imagination filling in the blanks. She backed away from the window, her arms wrapped around herself as if to ward off the icy dread creeping through her. "There has to be another way out," she said, her voice rising slightly. "A back door, a hatch, something." Nate turned his attention to the rest of the cabin, scanning the dim interior. The single room was sparse, a small table with 2 overturned chairs, a pile of rotting wood in the corner, and a cabinet hanging off its hinges. On the far side of the room was another door, slightly ajar. "There," Nate said, pointing. He moved quickly, pulling the door open to reveal a narrow staircase leading downward. The faint, musty smell of damp earth wafted up to meet them. "A basement," Emily whispered, glancing at Nate. "You think it's safe?" "Safer than up here," Nate said grimly. "At least it'll give us some time to figure out what to do." Another crash shook the cabin as something heavy slammed against the door, harder than before. The chair slipped slightly, the bolt barely holding. Emily didn't need any more convincing. She grabbed Nate's arm, and together they descended the creaking stairs, the dim light from the cabin fading with each step. The basement was colder, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. The faint glow of a single lantern sat on a rickety shelf, casting long shadows across the damp stone walls. Nate grabbed the lantern and turned it up, illuminating the space just enough for them to see. The basement was small, cluttered with broken tools, empty crates, and piles of debris. Emily moved to the far wall, her hands trembling as she searched for anything they could use to barricade themselves further. Her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, a large, rusted axe leaning in the corner. She grabbed it, holding it tightly as she turned to Nate. "If it comes down here," Nate nodded, gripping the poker like a lifeline. Above them, the sounds continued. The scrape of claws against wood, the heavy, deliberate pacing. And then, as if to confirm their worst fears, came the sound of splintering wood, the door upstairs giving way. Emily froze, her blood turning to ice. "It's inside!" The sound of the door shattering echoed through the cabin above, a deafening crack that sent dust raining down from the basement ceiling. Emily clutched the axe tighter, her knuckles whitening as her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the vibration of each heavy step the creature took, the wooden floorboards groaning under its weight. It was inside now, moving slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the hunt. Nate gestured for Emily to stay quiet, holding a finger to his lips. His other hand gripped the lantern, casting trembling light across the dank basement walls. They exchanged a glance, brief but loaded with unspoken fear. Neither dared to breathe too loudly, as though the creature might hear even the faintest sound. Above them, the heavy footfalls grew closer, each one resonating with a dull thud that made Emily flinch. The creature was exploring, sniffing, its guttural breathing so loud it seemed to fill the entire cabin. A sharp metallic screech followed, as if it had dragged something, a chair or a table, across the floor. Emily's thoughts raced. What does it want? Is it hunting us for sport? Or is this something darker? She tried to push the questions aside, focusing instead on survival. The basement was a dead end. There were no windows, no exits. The realization settled over her like a weight. If the creature came down the stairs, they would have no escape. Nate moved quietly toward the bottom of the staircase, crouching low as he positioned himself near the lantern. He turned the light down to a faint flicker, plunging the room into near darkness. Emily stayed back, pressed against the wall, the axe trembling slightly in her grip. The faint light made the shadows seem alive, twisting and moving in the corners of her vision. Then came the sound that made her blood run cold, a creak, sharp and deliberate from the top of the staircase. The creature was there, just beyond the door. It had found the basement. Emily bit her lip to stifle a gasp, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might give them away. Nate motioned for her to stay still, his face pale but determined. The creaking continued, each step down the staircase slow and purposeful. Whatever it wasn't in a hurry. It was descending with an almost predatory confidence. The light from the lantern caught movement on the stairs, a massive shadow, blocking out what little glow filtered through the broken planks above. Emily strained her eyes, trying to make out the details, but the darkness seemed to conspire against her. All she could see was the sheer size of it, an outline too large and too unnatural to be anything familiar. The creature paused halfway down, the stair groaning beneath its weight. For a moment, everything was still, the silence stretching taut. Emily's grip on the axe tightened, her muscles coiled as adrenaline coursed through her. She glanced at Nate, who had positioned himself behind the lantern, his weapon raised. And then, without warning, the creature lunged. The staircase groaned as it launched itself downward, its massive form crashing into the basement. Emily screamed as the lantern fell, the glass shattering and plunging the room into complete darkness. "Emily, move!" Nate shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. She stumbled backwards, swinging the axe wildly as the sound of the creature's guttural growl filled the room. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. The air was thick with the stench of earth and decay. Nate swung the poker, the metal colliding with something solid. A sharp, pained roar erupted, shaking the walls. The creature lashed out, its claws catching Nate's arm and sending him sprawling into the debris. Emily screamed his name, her voice breaking as she swung the axe again, this time connecting with something fleshy. A howl of rage followed, but it wasn't enough to stop the creature. "Get out of here!" Nate yelled, his voice strained with pain. "Run, Emily!" But there was nowhere to run. The basement was their tomb. Emily's breath came in sharp gasps as she scrambled back, her feet slipping on the damp floor. The creature loomed in the darkness, a massive shadow that seemed to absorb all light. She could hear it breathing, low, guttural, almost a growl, as it recovered from the blows they'd managed to land. Its movements were deliberate, each shift of its enormous frame radiating an unspoken menace. Nate groaned, struggling to push himself upright. Blood dripped from his arm, but was just dark against the faint light of the shattered lantern's embers. "Stay back!" he shouted, swinging the poker again, though the force of the creature's last strike had left him weakened. Emily felt the cold steel of the axe in her hands, her only lifeline against whatever was hunting them. She forced herself to focus, swallowing the bile rising in her throat. "Over here!" she screamed, her voice trembling but loud enough to echo off the stone walls. She swung the axe in a wide arc, the sound slicing through the air. The creature turned toward her, its glowing amber eyes cutting through the darkness. For the first time, she got a clear glimpse of its face. Twisted, almost human, yet monstrous, in a way that defied explanation. Its mouth curled back in a snarl, revealing sharp, uneven teeth, and its breath fogged the air in heavy bursts. Her legs felt like lead, but she managed to take a step forward, brandishing the axe as if it could bridge the overwhelming gap in size and power. "Come on," she shouted, trying to lure it away from Nate. Her voice cracked, but it had the desired effect. The creature lunged toward her with terrifying speed, its massive arms swinging wide. Emily ducked just in time, the air above her head whooshing as one of its claws missed her by inches. She stumbled but kept her grip on the axe, swinging it upward in a desperate arc. The blade bit into the creature's side, and it roared in fury, a sound so loud it rattled the walls and sent chills down her spine. It staggered, but only for a moment. The blow seemed to have done more to enrage it than slow it down. It turned on her again, its movements faster now, more erratic. Emily backed up, her foot catching on a broken crate. She fell hard, the axe slipping from her hands and skittering out of reach. "Emily!" Nate shouted. He forced himself to his feet, despite the blood dripping from his arm and the pain etched into his face. With a cry of desperation, he threw the poker, aiming for the creature's head. The makeshift weapon struck its mark, hitting the creature squarely between its glowing eyes. The beast roared, rearing back, its clawed hands clutching its face. For a brief moment, it was distracted, stumbling blindly in the confined space. Nate seized the opportunity, staggering toward Emily and grabbing her arm. "Get up!" he hissed, pulling her to her feet. They bolted together, heading for the farthest corner of the basement, where a pile of debris hinted at a possible escape. Emily's mind raced as she scanned the area. Her eyes locked onto a small opening, a crude hole in the stone wall, partially hidden by the rubble. It was barely large enough to squeeze through, but it might be their only chance. "There!" she gasped, pointing. Nate saw it too, his face tightening with determination. "Go!" he urged, shoving her toward the gap. Emily dropped to her knees, clawing at the debris to clear the opening. The creature roared again, its fury filling the room as it regained its senses. It charged toward them, its footfalls shaking the ground, but Nate stepped between Emily and the oncoming beast. "Hurry!" he shouted, grabbing a splintered piece of wood from the floor. He held it like a spear, his injured arm trembling as he prepared for the creature's next attack. Emily shoved the last of the rubble aside and crawled into the hole. The air was colder here, damp and suffocating, but it was a way out. She turned back to Nate, her eyes wide with terror. "Come on!" she cried, reaching for him. The creature lunged and Nate braced himself. "Go!" he roared, his voice cutting through her hesitation. And then the room exploded into chaos. The chaos unfolded in an instant, the air splitting with the creature's roar as it lunged at Nate. He thrust the splintered wood forward, aiming for its chest. The improvised weapon struck, splintering further on impact, but slowing the beast just enough to keep it from barreling into him. Nate staggered back, his body screaming in protest, but he didn't stop. Emily's heart pounded as she crouched in the narrow tunnel, her hands trembling as she reached out toward him. "Nate, come on, you can make it!" The creature bellowed, ripping the broken wood from its torso and tossing it aside like a toothpick. Its glowing eyes locked on Nate, filled with a fury that seemed almost intelligent, as if it understood his defiance. Nate glanced at Emily, his face pale but determined, then back at the creature. "I said go!" he shouted, his voice cracking with the strain. Emily hesitated, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to pull him into the tunnel, to drag him away from the monstrous thing bearing down on him, but the space was too tight. There was no room for both of them at once. The opening loomed behind her like a lifeline she couldn't bear to take alone. Nate turned and grabbed a piece of rusted metal from the floor, swinging it at the beast in a wide arc. The jagged edge caught its arm, slicing through fur and muscle, but it barely flinched. Instead, it roared again, the sound deafening in the confined space, and swiped at Nate with one massive claw. The blow sent him flying, his body crashing into the stone wall with a sickening thud. "Nate!" Emily screamed, her voice raw. He crumpled to the ground, dazed but alive, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. The creature advanced, stepping over the debris with terrifying ease, its hulking form blotting out the dim light. It was closer now, its breath hot and rancid, its amber eyes locked on Nate like a predator savoring its kill. Emily couldn't wait any longer. She scrambled backward into the tunnel, her body scraping against the rough stone as she squeezed herself deeper into the cramped space. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she clawed at the dirt and rock, desperate to put as much distance as possible between her and the monster. But every instinct screamed at her to stop, to turn back for Nate. "Nate!" she cried again, her voice echoing in the narrow passage. There was a pause, a beat of silence so heavy it felt like time itself had stopped. Then she heard him, his voice weak but firm. "Keep going, Emily. Don't stop." The sound of something heavy crashing to the floor snapped her back to reality. She didn't want to leave him, but the urgency in his voice pushed her forward. She crawled faster, the walls of the tunnel pressing against her on all sides. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, but she didn't look back. Behind her, the sounds of the struggle intensified, the creature's growls, Nate's grunts of effort, the sharp clatter of metal and stone. Emily bit her lip, tears streaming down her face as she crawled blindly forward. She wanted to scream, to run back and fight, but she knew she wouldn't stand a chance. Nate had made his choice, and she had to honor it. The tunnel suddenly widened, and Emily tumbled into a small cavern. The air here was damp and stale, the faint sound of dripping water echoing off the walls. She collapsed onto the cold ground, her body shaking with sobs, her hands gripping the dirt as though it could anchor her in place. Then, silence. The sounds from the basement ceased, leaving only the steady drip of water and her ragged breathing. She stared back at the tunnel's dark opening, waiting for any sign, any sound that Nate had made it out. But nothing came, only the oppressive weight of the silence. Emily sat frozen in the cold cavern, her breath shallow and her body trembling as the silence stretched on. The absence of sound was suffocating, the stillness pressing against her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. She stared at the black mouth of the tunnel, her heart thundering in her ears. Every passing second without a sound from Nate was a dagger twisting deeper into her chest. "Nate," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic dripping of water. It wasn't a call, it was a plea, a fragile hope that he might still answer. But there was nothing, just the darkness, vast and unyielding. Her fingers clenched into fists, the dirt cold and damp against her skin. She wanted to move, to do something, but her body refused to obey. The thought of going back into that tunnel filled her with equal parts dread and guilt. What if he's still alive? What if he needs me? The questions clawed at her, but the primal fear gripping her heart kept her rooted to the spot. The cavern around her was small, its walls slick with moisture and streaked with moss. In the faint light from her phone, which she shakily pulled from her pocket, she could make out a small opening on the far side. It wasn't much, just a jagged gap in the stone, but it offered a direction, a way forward. Yet her gaze kept drifting back to the tunnel, the darkness calling her to face the truth she didn't want to accept. A faint sound broke the silence, a low, echoing growl that sent a chill racing down her spine. It wasn't coming from the tunnel. It was coming from somewhere deeper within the cavern. Her breath hitched as she scrambled to her feet, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The dim glow illuminated only a small circle around her, leaving the rest of the space shrouded in shadow. The growl came again, this time accompanied by the faint scuffle of movement. It wasn't the creature she had seen before, not the massive hulking figure that had attacked them. This sound was different, lighter, quicker, as though something smaller but no less dangerous was prowling in the dark. Emily's heart raced as she backed toward the gap in the far wall, her eyes darting around the cavern. Her phone's light caught movement, a flash of something low to the ground, skittering just beyond her reach. She stifled a scream, her body pressed against the cold stone. Whatever it wasn't alone. She could hear them now, faint whispers of movement circling her, closing in. "Stay back," she whispered, though her voice was little more than a trembling breath. She raised the phone higher, trying to see more, but the light was weak, swallowed by the oppressive dark. One of the shapes darted closer, and she caught a glimpse of it. A gaunt, twisted creature with eyes that reflected the faint glow of her phone like shards of broken glass. It moved on all fours, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, its mouth opening in a silent snarl that revealed rows of jagged teeth. Panic surged through her, and she turned toward the gap, her only chance of escape. She dropped to her hands and knees, crawling through the narrow space as quickly as she could. The stone scraped against her palms and knees, but she didn't care. Behind her, the sounds grew louder, the creatures scrambling after her, their claws scratching against the stone. She emerged into another passage, this one even narrower than the first. The walls pressed against her shoulders as she moved, forcing her to stay low. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, the air colder and thinner the farther she went. The growls behind her echoed through the tunnel, growing fainter, but no less menacing. Finally, the passage opened into another cavern, larger than the last. A faint light filtered in from above, a crack in the ceiling that revealed a sliver of the night sky. Emily collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air as she looked up at the stars. For a moment, the beauty of the sky calmed her, but the silence returned, and with it, the crushing realization that she was still alone. Nate was gone, and the things in the dark were still out there, waiting. Emily lay on the cold, damp ground, staring up at the thin crack of sky above. The stars winked faintly, distant and indifferent to her plight. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, the ache in her chest growing heavier as her mind replayed the last moments in the basement. Nate's voice, his defiance, his command to run, it all crashed down on her in a suffocating wave of guilt. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, stifling the sob that threatened to escape. I left him to die. Her fingers dug into the gritty dirt beneath her as she fought the rising panic. The weight of her solitude pressed against her ribs like iron bands. The faint light from her phone cast weak shadows across the cavern walls, but the darkness seemed alive, creeping closer with every second. The stillness was broken by a faint noise, a skittering sound, distant but growing louder. Emily's breath hitched as she turned her head toward the passage she had just crawled through. The creatures. They were coming. She pushed herself up, her limbs weak and trembling, and scanned the cavern for any way out. Her eyes locked onto the crack in the ceiling. It wasn't much, a jagged slit in the stone, maybe 2 feet wide, but it was her only chance. Faint moonlight spilled through, illuminating a rocky outcrop that looked just climbable enough to reach the opening. She forced herself to move, stumbling toward the outcrop. Her legs felt heavy, her knees weak, but adrenaline pushed her forward. She reached the base of the formation and grabbed hold of the first ledge, the rough stone biting into her palms. Her muscles screamed in protest as she hauled herself upward, but she didn't stop. The skittering grew louder, echoing through the cavern like a swarm of insects. She risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately regretted it. The creatures were emerging from the narrow passage, their twisted bodies writhing as they spilled into the open space. Their eyes glinted in the faint light, reflecting hunger and malice. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she climbed faster, her fingers scrambling for purchase on the uneven rock. The creatures moved with unsettling speed, their elongated limbs propelling them forward in jerky, unnatural motions. One of them let out a high-pitched screech that sent a shiver racing down her spine. She reached the top of the outcrop, her hands brushing against the edges of the crack in the ceiling. The gap was barely large enough for her to fit through, but she didn't hesitate. She twisted her body, forcing herself into the narrow opening, the jagged edges scraping against her sides. The screeching below grew frantic as the creatures reached the base of the outcrop. Emily pulled herself upward with all her strength, her nails breaking as she clawed at the rough stone. She felt something brush against her ankle, a cold, sharp claw, and screamed, kicking out wildly. The contact broke, and she scrambled higher, her body trembling with exertion. Finally, she burst through the crack, her lungs sucking in the cold night air. She collapsed onto the forest floor, the damp leaves and soil clinging to her skin. For a moment, she lay there, gasping, her body too exhausted to move. But the screeching didn't stop. It echoed from below, furious and unrelenting. She scrambled to her feet, staggering away from the crack. The creatures couldn't climb after her, not yet, but she couldn't take the chance. She had to keep moving. The forest around her was cloaked in shadows, the moonlight barely piercing the thick canopy above. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent her heart racing. The sounds from the cavern faded as she stumbled forward, her legs unsteady but determined. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know if there was anywhere to go. But one thing was clear: she wasn't safe yet. The forest stretched endlessly before Emily, an endless maze of shadow and sound. Her legs felt like lead, her body aching with exhaustion, but she forced herself forward. The cool night air stung her raw hands and scraped knees, but the pain was a welcome reminder that she was still alive, still moving. The screeches from the creatures had faded, muffled by the layers of earth and roots, but the memory of their clawed hands and jagged teeth lingered sharp in her mind. Her breaths came in shallow bursts, each one catching in her throat as she stumbled over twisted roots and uneven ground. The forest floor seemed alive with movement, branches swaying in an unseen breeze, leaves rustling without reason. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the glowing eyes of those things from below. But there was nothing, only shadows. Her grip tightened on her phone, the weak beam of its flashlight flickering across the gnarled trees ahead. It was her only light, though it did little to pierce the oppressive darkness around her. Every so often, she'd hear a noise, a distant crack of a branch or the whisper of something moving through the underbrush, and she'd freeze, her heart pounding, until the silence returned. "I have to keep going," she told herself, swallowing the rising lump in her throat. She didn't know where she was heading, but standing still wasn't an option. Nate's voice echoed in her mind, his last words urging her to run. She clenched her jaw, pushing the memory down before it overwhelmed her. The trees began to thin slightly, revealing a clearing up ahead. Emily slowed her pace, her instincts screaming for caution. The clearing was bathed in faint moonlight, the grass shimmering with dew. In its center stood something that made her stop in her tracks, a structure, old and weathered, leaning slightly as if struggling against the weight of time. It was another cabin, smaller than the one she and Nate had found earlier. Its roof sagged, and the wooden walls were streaked with moss and rot. A faint, almost imperceptible light glowed from within, spilling through a cracked window and the gaps in the planks. Emily's first instinct was to turn away, to keep moving. The cabin radiated an eerie stillness, as though it had been waiting for her. But her exhaustion left her no choice. She needed shelter, a moment to think, and maybe, just maybe, answers. She tightened her grip on the phone and took a hesitant step forward. The clearing was unnervingly silent as she approached, the sounds of the forest falling away. Her heart thudded in her chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. She reached the cabin's warped door and paused, her hand hovering over the rusted handle. The faint glow inside flickered like a candle struggling against the wind. Emily pushed the door open slowly, its hinges groaning in protest. The interior was dark and smelled of damp wood and mildew. Her flashlight swept across the room, revealing broken furniture, an old stove, and walls lined with shelves holding jars filled with unidentifiable substances. And then she saw it. A journal sitting open on a rickety table in the center of the room. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. Beside it, a lantern burned weakly, the source of the faint light she'd seen. Emily stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She approached the journal cautiously, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. The air was thick, the silence oppressive. She reached out and touched the worn pages, her fingers trembling. The words scrawled across the open page made her stomach drop. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." The room seemed to grow colder as she read the words. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end, and she had the sudden, suffocating feeling that she wasn't alone. The chilling words on the journal's page burned into Emily's mind as her trembling fingers turned the next sheet, desperate for more answers. The script was uneven, scrawled in hurried strokes as if the writer had been frantic to get their thoughts down. The entries were fragmented, disjointed, and unsettlingly personal. They move in the shadows, always watching. The eyes, so many eyes. I tried to run, but the forest twists and changes. It doesn't let you leave. Emily's breath hitched as she scanned the next line, her pulse racing. The creatures aren't the only danger. The forest itself is alive. It pulls you deeper, feeds on your fear. Fear, there's no escape. She stepped back from the table, the journal still open, her heart hammering in her chest. The faint warmth from the lantern was the only thing keeping the oppressive cold of the cabin at bay. The smell of mildew and decay hung heavy in the air, making it difficult to breathe. Her phone flickered again, the flashlight's beam growing weaker. She cursed under her breath, fumbling to check the battery. Barely 5% remained, the warning symbol flashing like a countdown to darkness. Emily glanced at the journal again, hesitating. She knew she should take it. It might hold the key to understanding what was happening, but the words on the page seemed to radiate a strange energy, as though touching them too long would anchor her to this cursed place. A faint noise broke her thoughts, a shuffle just outside the cabin. Her body tensed, her breath catching in her throat. She turned the phone's light toward the door, its weak beam illuminating the warped wood. The noise came again, louder this time, like something dragging across the porch. Emily backed away, her eyes darting toward the nearest window. The glass was too grimy to see through clearly, but the faint glow of the moon revealed shifting shapes outside. Shadows moved across the clearing, fluid and erratic, as though circling the cabin. Her throat tightened. The creatures. They found me. The handle of the door rattled, sending her heart racing. Emily grabbed the journal instinctively, clutching it to her chest as she scanned the room for a weapon. Her phone's light caught the glint of something metallic, a rusted knife lying forgotten on a shelf. She darted toward it, grabbing the blade and gripping it tightly despite its dull edge and the grime encrusting the handle. The door creaked, the wood bending as if under immense pressure. Emily stumbled backward, her feet catching on a broken chair as the door gave way with a splintering crack. A figure loomed in the doorway, but it wasn't one of the creatures she'd encountered before. This was something else entirely. It was human, or at least it had been once. A man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His clothes were tattered, the remnants of a jacket hanging from his thin frame. But it was his expression that froze Emily in place, wide-eyed terror mixed with a twisted smile, as though he'd seen something so horrifying that his mind had shattered. "Leave," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. He stepped into the cabin, his movements jerky and unnatural. "You shouldn't have come here. It won't let you go." Emily backed further into the room, gripping the knife so tightly her knuckles turned white. What are you talking about?" she stammered. The man's eyes darted to the journal in her hands, and he recoiled as though it burned him. "You've seen it," he muttered, his voice trembling. "The writing. You're part of it now. It's seen you." His words sent a chill racing down her spine. "What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice rising. "What is it?" But before he could answer, a deafening crash came from the side of the cabin. The wall buckled inward, the wood splintering as one of the creatures forced its way inside, its glowing eyes locking onto Emily. The man's twisted smile vanished, replaced by sheer panic. "Run," he croaked. "Run before it takes you too." But the creature lunged before she could move. The creature barreled into the cabin, its massive form shattering the fragile wooden wall as if it were paper. Splinters flew through the air, cutting across Emily's face and hands. The force of the impact knocked her backward, and she hit the ground hard, the journal sliding from her grasp and landing near the broken lantern. The gaunt man let out a guttural cry, his voice raw with terror. "You can't stop it! You can't fight it!" he screamed, retreating toward the corner of the room. His thin frame trembled as he pressed himself against the wall, as though hoping the shadows might swallow him whole. Emily scrambled to her feet, clutching the rusted knife. The creature turned its glowing eyes on her, its twisted, hulking form illuminated in the dim flicker of the lantern. It moved on powerful, sinewy limbs, its skin a patchwork of fur and scarred flesh. Its growl was deep, reverberating through the small cabin, shaking the floor beneath her feet. The man's words echoed in her mind. "You can't fight it." But what other choice did she have? The creature lunged, its massive claws swiping through the air. Emily dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike, the knife slipping from her sweat-slicked hand in the process. She hit the ground hard, gasping as pain shot up her arm. The creature turned, its glowing eyes narrowing as if savoring her fear. Her gaze darted to the journal lying just a few feet away. The flickering lantern light danced across its open pages, casting eerie shadows. She didn't know why, but something inside her screamed that the journal was important, that it held a clue, a way to survive. The creature roared again, its attention shifting momentarily as the gaunt man began to sob, his broken cries filling the cabin. "It doesn't let you go," he wailed. "It feeds on you." Emily seized the moment, crawling toward the journal. Her fingers closed around its brittle pages just as the creature turned back to her, its growl deepening. She rolled onto her back, clutching the journal to her chest as the creature loomed over her, its foul breath hot against her face. The man's screams grew louder, but his words cut through the chaos. "Read it," he shouted, his voice raw. "The words. Say them out loud." Emily's hands trembled as she fumbled to open the journal. The pages flipped wildly in her shaking grip, the faded ink blurring before her eyes. The creature snarled, its claw raised to strike, but something about the man's desperation, his absolute certainty, kept her focused. She found the page. The writing was jagged, hastily scrawled, and utterly alien. The symbols made no sense, but something deep inside her seemed to recognize them, as though they were burned into her subconscious. She opened her mouth, the words spilling out before she could think. The effect was immediate. The creature recoiled, its roar splitting the air, a sound that was more pain than anger. The ground beneath her seemed to shift, the cabin groaning as though it were alive. The lantern's flame flared bright, casting stark, unnatural shadows against the walls. Emily continued to read, her voice steadying as the symbols grew clearer in her mind. The creature thrashed, its claws raking the walls as if trying to escape the sound of her voice. The gaunt man cowered, his face buried in his hands, rocking back and forth as he muttered incoherently. The journal grew warmer in her hands, the symbols glowing faintly. The creature let out one final, ear-piercing shriek, its body writhing as it collapsed onto the floor. For a moment, it lay there, twitching, its glowing eyes dimming until they were nothing but empty sockets. Then it went still. The cabin fell silent, the oppressive weight of the air lifting slightly. Emily sat frozen, the journal still clutched tightly in her hands. Her chest heaved as she stared at the creature's lifeless form, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The man in the corner slowly lifted his head, his wide, hollow eyes locking on hers. "You stopped it," he whispered, his voice shaking. "For now." Emily's stomach turned at his words. She wasn't safe. Not yet. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily sat frozen, the journal clutched against her chest, her breathing ragged as the weight of the moment crashed over her. The creature's body lay still on the cabin floor, its massive form casting grotesque shadows in the flickering light of the dying lantern. She couldn't tear her eyes away from it, half expecting it to move, to lunge, to spring back to life. The gaunt man in the corner began to stir, his trembling frame barely able to hold itself upright. He wiped a shaky hand across his face, smearing dirt and sweat. His hollow eyes met hers, filled with a mix of awe and fear. "You spoke the words," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "You read the binding." Emily's grip on the journal tightened. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "What is this thing? What is happening?" He took a faltering step toward her, his movements jerky and unsteady, like a puppet on frayed strings. "It's not just the creature," he said, his gaze flicking nervously to the darkened corners of the room. "This place, it's alive. It's all connected. Part of the forest. Part of them." Emily shook her head, her pulse pounding in her ears. "That doesn't make sense," she said, her voice rising. "What do you mean it's alive?" "The forest doesn't let go," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It twists reality, bends it, traps you. The creatures are its enforcers, but it's bigger than them. It's ancient and hungry." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Emily's mind raced, pieces of the night's horror falling into place. The forest's strange shifting paths, the way it seemed to swallow light and sound, the unnatural movements of the creatures, it all pointed to something far greater, something she couldn't comprehend. Her attention snapped back to the man as he continued speaking, his voice barely audible. "The journal, it's part of it. It records everything, those who've come before, the ones who tried to escape. It holds the forest's secrets, but it's also a trap. The more you read, the deeper it pulls you in." Emily's stomach turned, her grip on the journal loosening slightly. "Why did you tell me to read it?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You said it was the only way to stop that thing." "And it was," he said quickly, his eyes darting to the lifeless creature. "But now it knows you. You've marked yourself." Her knees buckled, and she staggered backward, the journal slipping from her hands and falling to the floor. "What do you mean? It knows me?" The man's gaze darkened, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice to a hushed whisper. "The forest doesn't kill outright. It feeds, it hunts. And now it's hunting you." A chill ran down her spine, and the room seemed to tilt. The journal on the floor glowed faintly, the symbols on its open pages pulsing like a heartbeat. Emily stumbled away from it, her back hitting the wall as panic clawed at her chest. "I have to get out of here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man shook his head slowly. "There's no way out. Not really. The forest will twist the paths, lead you back, again and again. It's already started." "No," she said firmly, her voice rising. "I'm not staying here. I'll find a way." The man's twisted smile returned, a grim, resigned expression. "You can try," he said. "But it's already inside you. You read the words. It's part of you now." A sudden gust of wind blew through the cabin, extinguishing the lantern and plunging them into complete darkness. Emily's heart seized as she scrambled for her phone, the weak beam of light trembling in her unsteady hands. She turned it toward the man, but he was gone. Only the faint sound of his retreating footsteps echoed through the night, and then from somewhere deep in the forest, a low, guttural growl rumbled through the trees. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. The growl reverberated through the cabin, low and menacing, like the earth itself had rumbled awake. Emily's heart thudded against her ribs as she spun toward the sound, her phone's trembling light cutting jagged paths through the darkness. Outside, the wind hissed through the broken wall, carrying with it a faint, unnatural whisper, a sound like voices, but too twisted to be human. She crouched, her fingers brushing against the journal on the floor. It still pulsed faintly, its pages glowing with a dull, rhythmic light that seemed to sync with the pounding of her heart. Every instinct screamed at her to leave it behind, but something stronger, a desperate need for answers, for survival, compelled her to pick it up. The weight of it in her hands felt heavier than before, as though it had absorbed the dread filling the room. Emily edged toward the broken wall, the cold night air biting at her skin. The clearing outside was eerily quiet, the grass rippling under the pale light of the moon. The cabin's oppressive atmosphere seemed to seep into the forest, every shadow stretching unnaturally long, every rustling leaf carrying the promise of unseen watchers. Her phone flickered again, the battery icon flashing its warning. No, she whispered, panic clawing at her throat. She needed the light. Without it, she wouldn't last 5 minutes in the endless dark of the forest. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Emily froze, her pulse spiking as she strained to pinpoint the direction of the noise. The clearing seemed empty, but the shadows at the edge of the forest writhed as though alive, shifting with a sickly fluidity that made her stomach churn. Run! The words screamed in her mind, and before she could think, her legs obeyed. She bolted into the forest, the journal clutched tightly against her chest, her phone's flickering beam lighting the uneven ground ahead. Branches whipped at her face and arms, the cold air stinging her lungs as she pushed herself forward. The sounds behind her grew louder, pursuing footsteps, guttural growls, and that eerie, whispered chorus that seemed to echo all around her. Emily didn't dare look back. The forest closed in tighter, the trees pressing together as if conspiring to trap her. Her footing faltered on the uneven ground, and she stumbled, nearly falling, but she forced herself upright and kept running. The journal pulsed in her hands, its glow growing brighter with every step. It felt like it was guiding her, pulling her towards something deeper in the forest. The whispers grew clearer now, weaving words she couldn't quite understand, but that filled her with an inexplicable dread. The growls were closer, the footsteps pounding like war drums. Her phone's light flickered once more before going dark completely, plunging her into near blackness. No, 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 she gasped, her voice breaking. She fumbled with the phone, hoping to coax another flicker of light, but it was useless. The darkness swallowed her, leaving only the faint glow of the journal to guide her. Suddenly, the forest opened into another clearing, this one dominated by an enormous ancient tree. Its gnarled branches twisted upward like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky, and its trunk was scarred with strange, glowing symbols, identical to those in the journal. Emily skidded to a halt, her chest heaving as she stared at the tree. The whispers grew deafening, the air around her vibrating with an unnatural energy. The ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse in time with the journal's glow, as though the forest itself were alive and breathing. She didn't hear the creature approach. It wasn't until the growl was right behind her, hot breath brushing the back of her neck, that she realized it was there. Emily spun around, raising the journal instinctively. The creature lunged, its glowing eyes filled with malice, but as it neared the book, it stopped, recoiling as though struck. The glow of the journal intensified, bathing the clearing in harsh, blinding light. The creature screamed, a sound of pure rage and agony, and Emily fell to her knees, the journal's heat searing her hands. She couldn't let go, even as the light burned brighter and the forest seemed to collapse around her, the whispers rising into a deafening crescendo. And then, everything went still. The stillness was so absolute it felt like time itself had stopped. Emily knelt in the clearing, the journal's searing glow fading back into a dull pulse. The enormous tree before her seemed to shimmer faintly, the glowing symbols etched into its trunk, dimming as though whatever energy had awakened them was retreating. The air was thick and heavy, but eerily quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the distant sounds of the forest creatures. Her hands trembled as she released the journal, letting it fall to the ground. The skin of her palms was red and raw from the heat, the pain sharp and stinging. She clutched her hands to her chest, trying to steady her breathing as she looked around the clearing. The creature was gone. No trace of its massive form, no glowing eyes lurking in the shadows. It was as if it had been swallowed by the light, but the silence pressed in on her, unnatural and suffocating. She staggered to her feet, her legs shaky and unsteady. Her heart still thundered in her chest, her mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. The journal lay at her feet, its pages fluttering faintly in a breeze that didn't exist. She stared at it, dread pooling in her stomach. The symbols on the cover seemed to glow faintly, as though alive. The tree loomed in front of her, its gnarled branches twisting upward in grotesque shapes. The markings carved into its trunk pulsed weakly, the same rhythm as the journal's glow. Emily stepped closer, compelled by a force she couldn't name. Her feet moved of their own accord, the earth beneath her soft and warm, as though the ground itself were alive. As she neared the tree, the whispers returned, soft at first, like the rustle of leaves, but growing louder with every step. They weren't words she could understand, but they filled her mind, crawling through her thoughts like vines. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The voices were inside her now. The base of the tree was scarred with deep grooves, symbols similar to those in the journal, but far more intricate. They glowed faintly, pulsating in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Emily reached out hesitantly, her fingers hovering just above the bark. The air around the tree seemed warmer, heavier, and her skin prickled with static. The whispers rose into a crescendo as her fingers brushed the trunk. A jolt of energy surged through her, and her vision went white. She stumbled backward, clutching her head as images flooded her mind. Flashes of faces, places, and moments she didn't recognize but somehow knew. A man screaming in the forest, clawed hands dragging him into the shadows. A group of hikers staring in horror as the ground beneath them split open. A glowing tree, its branches reaching out to consume the sky. Emily gasped, falling to her knees. The visions faded, leaving her breathless and shaking. She looked up at the tree, its symbols now glowing brighter as though it had awakened fully. The journal lay beside her, its pages fluttering once more, and she realized with a sinking dread that the whispers weren't coming from the tree or the forest. They were coming from inside her. She clutched her head, panic surging as the realization took hold. She wasn't free of the forest. She never would be. It had marked her, just as the gaunt man had said. It had seeped into her very being, binding her to this place, to its will. Emily's scream tore through the clearing, raw and unrestrained, but it was swallowed by the silence, absorbed into the forest's ever-watchful grasp. The scream died in her throat, consumed by the oppressive stillness of the forest. Emily clutched her head, trembling as the whispers clawed at her mind, their unintelligible chorus growing louder with each passing second. Her surroundings blurred, the towering trees and twisted branches melting into shadowy shapes. The ancient tree loomed over her, its glowing symbols pulsing in time with her racing heart. The journal lay at her feet, its faint light flickering like a dying ember. She stared at it, her breath shallow as the whispers began to shift, their chaotic murmurs coalescing into something almost coherent. Words rose from the noise, sharp and clear, cutting through her thoughts like shards of glass. Stay. Become. Feed the forest. No, Emily shouted, her voice cracking as she stumbled backward. She shook her head violently as though she could shake the words loose from her mind. I won't. I'm not yours. The forest didn't respond with words, but its power pressed against her like a suffocating weight. The trees seemed to lean closer, their skeletal branches clawing at the air, casting shifting shadows that danced around her like predators circling their prey. The ground beneath her feet softened, warm and pulsing as though alive. She clutched at her chest, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. The symbols from the tree burned in her vision even when she closed her eyes. The whispers filled her skull, and she could feel the forest pulling her, its will tightening like a noose around her mind. The journal's glow intensified, and a sudden, blinding light erupted from its pages. Emily screamed as the light enveloped her, its warmth searing her skin and forcing the shadows back. For a moment, the whispers faltered, replaced by a deafening silence. She opened her eyes to find herself standing in a strange, empty void. The forest was gone, the tree and its twisted branches replaced by an endless expanse of pale, featureless light. Emily, a voice called, soft and familiar. She turned, her heart leaping at the sight of Nate. He stood a few feet away, his face pale but calm, his eyes filled with an eerie serenity. His clothes were torn and bloodied, but he didn't seem to notice. He took a step toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. Nate, she whispered, her voice trembling. You're alive? He smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. I'm here, and so are you. She hesitated, something about his tone setting her on edge. His smile widened, unnatural and hollow, as he reached for her. The forest is inside us now, he said. There's no escape. It doesn't let us leave, but we can be part of it. We can belong. Emily staggered back, shaking her head. You're not Nate, she whispered, her voice breaking. You're something else. The figure stopped, its expression twisting into something grotesque. There is no escape, it said, its voice splitting into 1,000 echoes. The light around her flickered, and the forest began to bleed back into view. The towering trees, the suffocating darkness, the ancient tree with its glowing symbols. The journal burned in her hands, the light within it fighting to hold the forest's power at bay. Emily felt the forest pulling her, dragging her into its grasp. But the journal resisted, its energy surging through her like a lifeline. With a scream of defiance, she tore the journal open and read the words scrawled on the final page. The symbols glowed brighter than ever, their energy erupting outward in a wave of light that consumed everything. The forest trembled, its whispers turning into a deafening roar before falling silent, and then darkness. When Emily opened her eyes, she was lying on the edge of the forest, the faint light of dawn breaking through the trees. The journal was gone, its weight no longer in her hands. She sat up slowly, her body aching, her mind heavy with the memories of the night. The forest behind her was quiet, its shadows still and unmoving. But she knew it wasn't over. The forest had let her go, for now, but its mark remained, etched deep within her soul. She stood, her gaze lingering on the trees for a moment before she turned and walked away. The whispers were silent, but she could still feel them, waiting, watching. The forest wasn't finished with her. It never would be.